Hey everybody, in today's video we're going to be taking a look at the 20mm F1.8 prime lens, and we're going to compare that directly to the 14-30 F4. Welcome to my new kind of temporary shooting location. Obviously, because of the situation that the world's in right now, I can't shoot from my normal location in London. So hopefully this is still good enough, and hopefully it doesn't detract from the important stuff that we go through in my videos, and hopefully you'll still find them useful. So, as I mentioned, we're going to be taking a look at the 20mm F1.8 prime. We're going to be comparing that directly to the 14-30mm zoom lens. Now, I decided to compare them only at the same focal length. So this is going to be 20mm versus 20mm at different apertures. Obviously, there's going to be certain situations where you can change the 14-30. You can zoom that 14-30 in and out. But I wanted to just show you the difference between the same focal lengths at different apertures to show you the differences in picture quality. And the results were actually really surprising. Obviously, I won't spoil kind of too much. We'll go through the results very shortly, but you might want to stick around to the end, mainly because for me, my choice of lens is actually still going to be the 14-30. I don't think I will replace the 14-30 in my bag with this 20mm prime. So we'll go through the examples and we'll take a look at that. As always, I just want to show you the examples, and then you guys can make your own mind up about, whether or not you agree or disagree. I'm just going to show you them side by side as they come out of camera, and I want you to kind of make your own mind up. If you agree with what I'm saying, great. If you don't agree with what I'm saying, then that's fine too. The test that I've done, as I mentioned, is I've compared both lenses at the same focal length at different apertures. I've also compared them both at f/16, just to show you the difference that you get from diffraction. And then I've also done tests to show you the difference in depth of field, and also a test to show you the difference with focus breathing. Now, there's a massive difference in focus breathing between the two lenses as well, so don't miss that. Let's go take a look at these tests that I've done and figure out which lens it is that might be best suited to you. Okay, everybody, so here we go. We have the 20mm 1.8 prime on the left, and we have the 14-30 f4 on the right. So the 20mm 1.8 prime currently is at f1.8, and it's obviously at 20mm. And the 14-30 is obviously at f4, but it is also at 20mm. So we're going to compare the focal length side by side at different apertures to see what the performance is between the two. So let's go take a look and see what we can see. Okay, so here we are at 1:1 first of all, and at the center of the frame, both images are nice and sharp, really well detailed. They're handling color really nicely. At 1:1, it'd be hard to choose between the two. Don't be distracted by the shallower depth of field, because obviously the 20mm lens is currently at 1.8, so it's wide open, whereas the 14-30 is still technically wide open, but at f4. At 1:1, they're fairly equal in terms of sharpness at the center. As we start to move around the frame towards the edges, we can start to see that depth of field difference come through, so obviously one being at f4, one being at 1.8. But we also see that the 20mm just holds up as it moves towards the edges of the frame in terms of sharpness. We can quite clearly see that the 20mm lens is sharper than the 14-30 is as we're moving towards the edge. And then we go right to the edge of the frame. You can see that even now at 1:1, the 20mm prime is just sharper than the 14-30 is in terms of corner sharpness. Now, that's a given, really. I'd kind of expect that, so there's no real shock there. What we'll do is we'll have a quick look at 2:1, see if there's any noticeable difference up close. So at 2:1, I am torn, really. I think at the center of the frame, at least at 2:1, the 14-30 is slightly sharper. And I think that's going to be because the 20mm prime is currently wide open at 1.8. I do expect that as soon as we test both of these lenses at f4, that 20mm prime is just going to sharpen up to the point that it will become much sharper than the 14-30 is. But at the center of the frame, currently, with the 20mm at 1.8 and the 14-30 at f4, I would choose the 14-30 in terms of sharpness. We'll check towards the edges, and this is obviously where we could see the difference even at 1:1. So now at 2:1, that difference becomes even more visible, and we can see the 14 to 30 is just losing that edge sharpness and detail, whereas the 20 retains that across the frame. Again, if we're looking at this Nikon logo here, the 20 is just ever so slightly sharper across the frame. So a bit of a tough one there really when we're looking at 2:1, because the 20mm isn't quite as sharp in the center, but it is sharper at the edges. What's more important for your style of photography, I think. So what we'll do is we'll stop the 20mm prime down to f4, so we'll compare both lenses at f4, see if there's any noticeable difference. Right, so 20mm prime on the left, 14 to 30 on the right. Both lenses are now at f4, so we're going to see what the 20mm is now like now that it's been stopped down. So technically the 14 to 30 is an advantage because it's still wide open, but we'll compare both the lenses at f8 in a minute. So at 1:1 at the center of the frame, it's difficult for me to choose between the two. Incredibly sharp, some really nice detail, and again, I wouldn't be able to say that either way that one lens is better than the other in this current situation, but let's have a look towards the edges. So we can see here that as was the case previously, I wasn't expecting this to change because we've obviously not changed the 14 to 30, but if anything now it's slightly more obvious that as we move away to the edges of the frame, the 20mm prime retains the sharpness and detail that it has at the center, whereas that 14 to 30 loses out somewhat much faster than the 20mm prime does. And then when we move right towards the edges, again we can see that that 20mm prime is just sharper, more detailed than the 14 to 30 is in the corner of the frame. If we're looking at the Z50 logo here, we'll take a quick look at 2:1, see if there's any other subtle differences, and then we'll move on to both the lenses at f8. Okay, so here we are at 2:1, and there's no difference at the center of the frame, to be honest. No matter what I look at, whether it's the detail in this strip line here, whether it's the detail around the edges of the boxes, there is literally no difference between these two lenses at the center of the frame when they're both at f4. Whichever one you use is going to give you the same result at the middle of the frame. However, when we move towards the edges, we've seen that 20mm lens is sharper than the 14 to 30 is as we move towards the edges, and that's kind of to be expected. Keep in mind it's a prime lens. We're comparing a prime lens here against kind of a mid-range zoom lens, if that makes sense. And then right towards the edges becomes apparent that again we can see the difference. So this little Nikon logo on the edge of the lens here is sharper, is more detailed than it is on that 20mm prime than it is on the 14 to 30, which is kind of what we'd expect. Because that was the case even when the 20mm was wide open. Now we've stopped it down to f4, you'd only expect that to improve. So we'll compare both these lenses at f8 to see what they look like then, so they're on a level playing field, because technically the 14 to 30 is still wide open. Okay, so here we are, both lenses are now at f8. So again we have the 20mm prime on the left at f8 and the 14 to 30mm prime at f8 on the right. Now we've got both lenses stopped down. Let's go take a look at both lenses and see what we can see at the center of the frame and then towards the edges. So here we are at 1:1, and as with most cases, both lenses are incredibly sharp and detailed at the center of the frame. There's no way of telling between them. Both identical at 1:1. There's no difference between them. Moving towards the edges of the frame, and surprisingly, again, it's difficult to tell personally. I'm reading this text here and maybe slightly more detailed on the 20mm, but then I read this text here and I feel like the 14 to 30 is maybe sharper. I mean, I'm going to put that down to as I am unsure as to which one. So let's go right to the edge over to the Z50. Okay, so I think maybe here. No, because I think the 20mm might be slightly sharper here, but the 14 looks slightly sharper here. I'm going to go with the fact that at 1:1, at f8, these lenses are identical, realistically. At 2:1, there's nothing in it again. You'd be really hard pushed. I mean, 2:1 isn't something you're going to use on a daily basis, no matter what you're using these lenses for. So the difference just isn't there. There's no difference between them at the center of the frame. So let's move towards the edges. Right, we are maybe ever so slightly sharper on the 20mm lens, but that difference is only really visible if I'm really trying to look in at the shots here in front of me, and I don't think you guys are going to see that difference once this video is uploaded to YouTube, for example. We'll move towards the edges. Can't decide between these two. Even at 2:1, I thought at least at 2:1 we'd be able to see some difference, but quite clearly at f8 they are pretty much identical, to be honest. Okay, so here we are with both lenses at f11, the 20mm prime on the left and the 14-30 on the right. I've just come straight into 2:1 because, again, they're still very similar. There's no way to kind of distinguish between the two. They do appear to be slightly softer than they are at f8, and that's mainly going to be because of diffraction. So remember, the camera body that I'm using them on is a Z7. Higher megapixel camera means that we're going to have a lower point of diffraction. So f11 is where that starts to kick in, and we can just see that they're a little bit softer than they would be at f8. That's obviously not the fault of the lenses, it's just physics and how the light travels through the lens when you use a smaller aperture number. So we can see that realistically they are still the same, the results are the same as they were in f8. Both the lenses are almost identical. And I'll just show you a quick example of what happens when that diffraction gets worse when you start shooting at f16. Okay, so here we are with both lenses now at f16, and again 20mm prime on the left, 14-30 on the right. And the reason I want to show you f16 is just to show you what happens with these lenses when diffraction starts to kick in. So we're currently looking at 1:1, and you can just kind of tell that the overall image is softer than it was before when we were looking at kind of f8. And if you look at 2:1, you can see that again the images are just soft. There's this haze that's kind of coming over the images as well when shooting at f16. And that is because of diffraction, and long said for a long period of time that to get the absolute best out of your lenses for landscape photography, you shouldn't be shooting kind of f16, f18, f22 because this diffraction is going to get worse. So that's why kind of f8, f11 for me is that sweet spot. And in most cases, you can get away with f11, but if you wanted the absolute best, then it would be f8. And we can see that the scenes are just, they're still identical. So there's no difference between them at f16, but diffraction is just taking some of that sharpness away from between both of them. Just to kind of show you that difference, what I'll do is I'll show you f8 versus f16. So on the left is f8, and on the right is f16. And you can see there quite clearly that there's a massive difference in detail and sharpness, and that is because of diffraction. So one last thing I thought might be useful just to show you is obviously because the 20mm prime is a 1.8 and the 14-30 is an f4, the depth of field difference means that you get, different out of focus areas, that type of stuff. And it might not be that you're all looking for the landscape side of the photography. So what we have is the 20mm prime 1.8 at 1.8 on the left, and the 14-30 obviously at f4 on the right. So the depth of field, everything just gets nice and smoother in the background and drops off. Whereas with the 14-30, things are just a little bit more rough. It's not really a lens that's designed for shallow depth of field photography. They are mainly lenses that are designed for kind of landscape photography, that type of thing. But hopefully it helps some of you just decide between these two lenses. Okay, so as I mentioned at the start of this video, I would still probably prefer to use the 14-30 versus the 20mm prime. And the reason for that is I love shooting ultra-wide landscape photography, and I also love shooting ultra-wide astrophotography. So for me, that 14mm focal length is the winner for me. It's the key. And if this was a 14mm prime instead of a 20mm prime, we would probably be having a different conversation. But I just can't get over needing to shoot 14mm. That might not be the case for you. 20mm might be the perfect focal length for what you want to try and shoot. But for me, I think the 14 to 30 is going to be the way that I go for now, because of that ultra wide 14mm focal length and the picture quality that it gives me at the center of the frame at least, and when we're stopped down, is just as good as the prime. As we saw in those comparisons, if you're a landscape photographer, generally you're shooting your lenses at f8, f11 anyway, so the difference between these lenses becomes very small. You only really start to see the advantage of the 20mm prime when the lenses are wide open and at the edges. So for me, that's just not enough for me to justify carrying a 20mm prime for the loss of my 14mm wide angle. So the lens that I'm going to go to and still keep in my bag and still be my go-to wide angle lens is going to be that 14 to 30 f4. And I don't think that will change for some time, at least until maybe the 14 to 24 2.8 becomes available. The way that I often think about it is, I think if you do very specific types of photography, or if you're a landscape photographer that knows that they love that 20mm focal length because you might find that 14 is a bit too wide and you know that you love that 20mm focal length, then this prime is going to be great for that. But I think if you're a photographer that wants to do a bit more varied photography and you shoot ultra wide, you want a bit of zoom, you want to zoom out, I would probably say that you're going to be better off with the 14 to 30. One thing I'll keep in mind is, yes, I will still shoot astrophotography with the 14 to 30. A lot of people will say, oh, the 20mm is going to give you the better shot, the 20mm is going to be the better lens. And that might be the case because it's brighter, obviously means you can shoot at 1.8. But don't always assume that you're looking at the difference of 1.8 versus 4. The reason for that is because shooting at 14mm allows me to use a longer shutter speed without any movement in my stars. Whereas with shooting with a 20mm prime means that I cannot use a long enough shutter speed. So that difference in light gained from f4 to 1.8 is somewhat lost in the gain of light we get from the slower shutter speed when we shoot at 14mm. It's not quite the same, and this lens will still allow you to let in a little bit more light, but realistically it's not going to be as big as the jump as people make it sounds out to be when you shoot from f4 to 1.8, for example. Shooting at 14mm with about 25-second shutter speed, f4, and about an ISO of 1600 or 3200 ISO on a Z7 and Z6, I get some fantastic results with that. Obviously, if I use the 20, my shutter speed cannot be as long, but I can shoot at a brighter 1.8 aperture. It's kind of counteracted by the shorter shutter speed. In most cases, it's going to come down to what lens you prefer and what focal length you think is going to be more useful for your type of photography. So I hope that you found this video useful. If you did like this video, then please give it a thumbs up. Also, if you've got any questions or comments about your thought process and your thought process between these two lenses, pop them in the comments as well, because I think there's a lot of people struggling to decide between these two lenses. Please look after yourself, keep safe, goodbye.